Sarah Whitaker had already taken off her coat when the call came in. Another pediatric emergency. Late evening. A child with fever, coughing, and labored breathing. It wasn't her shift. She had covered 2 nights earlier in the week and could have declined without explanation. Instead, she paused for only a second before agreeing and reaching for her keys. Her husband, Evan, was out of town again. A business trip. Like so many others over the years. The apartment was quiet, too quiet, and staying home would have meant sitting alone with thoughts she had learned to keep at bay. Work, at least, gave her purpose. It gave her something solid to hold on to. Sarah had been a pediatrician in Portland for nearly a decade. She loved her job, not in the dramatic sense, but in the steady, grounded way that came from responsibility. Children needed calm voices, clear decisions, and hands that did not shake. She had learned to be all of that. She and Evan had met during medical school. They married shortly after graduation, once internships were over and real life began. 10 years together. 10 years of shared routines, shared dinners, shared silences, and no children, not for lack of trying. There had been tests, treatments, quiet conversations late at night that ended without conclusions. Eventually, the doctors stopped offering new options. Sarah knew the problem was hers, even though Evan never said it aloud. He didn't blame her. At least, he never voiced it. He threw himself into work instead. Over the years, he built a small but successful auto repair business, expanding it slowly, carefully. With growth came travel, meetings, site visits, weeks away at a time. Sarah told herself it was normal, that this was simply how their life worked now. Still, there were evenings when the loneliness pressed in more heavily than usual. Evenings like this one. The ambulance cut through the city streets, lights flashing against dark windows. As they drove, Sarah listened to the medic's brief report and glanced at the address on the screen. It wasn't a neighborhood she usually covered. She noted the unfamiliar street name without much thought. She leaned back against the seat, breathing evenly, preparing herself to focus. Another child, another worried parent, another night where she would do what she always did. At that moment, everything in her life still felt intact. Routine, predictable, unbroken. She had no idea that within the hour, that sense of order would quietly collapse. The apartment was warm and overly quiet when Sarah stepped inside. The kind of stillness that came from fear rather than peace. A small girl lay on the couch, propped up by pillows, her breathing shallow and uneven. Each breath seemed to take effort. Her cheeks were flushed, her skin hot to the touch. Sarah introduced herself calmly and knelt beside the child. She asked her name, listened to her lungs, checked her temperature, her oxygen levels. Everything she did was precise, automatic, guided by years of training. The girl was 5 years old. Her name was Katie. While Sarah worked, the child's mother hovered nearby, wringing her hands. She spoke quickly, her voice tight with worry, explaining that the cough had started days ago, that the fever wouldn't stay down, that the breathing had become worse that morning. She apologized repeatedly, as if being afraid for her child required justification. Sarah nodded, absorbing the information without interrupting. When she finished the examination, she straightened and asked for the medical file. "It should be in the kitchen," the woman said, turning toward the hallway. "Evan, can you bring it?" Sarah barely registered the name at first. It was common enough. She was already thinking through possible diagnoses, considering next steps, when footsteps sounded behind her. She turned. Evan stood in the doorway, holding a thin folder in his hands. For a fraction of a second, neither of them moved. There was no dramatic pause, no spoken recognition. Just the quiet collision of two lives that were never meant to overlap like this. Sarah felt the moment hit her physically, like a sudden drop in temperature. Her first instinct was disbelief, followed by a sharp, disorienting clarity. She forced herself to inhale slowly, to keep her expression neutral. Whatever was happening inside her had to stay there. A child was sick. That was all that mattered. Evan's face changed as well, the color draining slightly, his eyes flicking to her and then away. He said nothing. He simply stepped forward and placed the file in her outstretched hand. The child's mother, Marina Collins, according to the paperwork, continued speaking, unaware of the shift that had just taken place. She asked if it was serious, if she should be worried, if she had done something wrong. Sarah flipped through the file, her hands steady despite the noise building in her head. She explained, in the same calm tone she always used, that more tests were needed, that the symptoms warranted closer monitoring, that the safest course was hospital admission. Marina nodded quickly, relief and fear mixing on her face. Sarah made the necessary calls, arranged transport, and gave clear instructions. Throughout it all, she did not look at Evan again. There would be time for questions later. For now, she held herself together, focused on the child, even as a silent realization settled heavily in her chest. The night air felt colder than it had minutes earlier when Sarah stepped out of the apartment building. The ambulance doors closed, lights flashing as the vehicle pulled away with the child and her mother inside. Sarah remained on the sidewalk for a moment longer than necessary, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, her mind strangely detached from her body. She walked toward her car without urgency, as if moving too quickly might disturb something fragile. Only once she was inside, with the engine running and the streetlights sliding past the windshield, did her thoughts begin to organize themselves. Katie was 5. The number surfaced first, uninvited, undeniable. 5 years old. Sarah did the math without effort. She did not need to count months or recall specific dates. The realization settled with a dull, suffocating weight. 5 years meant the overlap was not recent. It was not a mistake that could be isolated or explained away. It spanned most of her marriage. Her hands tightened briefly on the steering wheel. Evan had not simply betrayed her. He had divided his life. Carefully, repeatedly, he had learned how to move between 2 homes, 2 women, 2 versions of himself, without letting either collide, until now. The more she thought about it, the more details rearranged themselves into a pattern she could no longer ignore. The frequent business trips. The weekends he left early and returned late. The way he sometimes seemed distant, distracted, as if he were always catching up on something she could not see. She had accepted all of it as the cost of his ambition, of their circumstances, of the life they had built. Now that explanation collapsed. The pain that spread through her was not sharp. It was not explosive. It was a slow, numbing pressure, pressing inward from all sides. What unsettled her most was not the image of Evan with another woman, but the realization that the marriage she believed in had existed only partially. That for years she had been living inside a story that was never complete. Her sense of herself shifted. Wife, partner. The words suddenly felt unstable, as if they belonged to someone else. She wondered how long she had been unknowingly sharing her life with a stranger. Still, anger did not come. There was no surge of rage, no urge to scream or call him immediately. Instead, there was disbelief, a quiet, hollow disbelief that left her feelings suspended, as though she were watching her own life from a distance. By the time she reached home, Sarah understood one thing clearly. Nothing had broken loudly, but everything had changed. Evan came home just before dawn. Sarah was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of untouched coffee cooling between her hands. She had not slept, not because she was replaying the night in dramatic loops, but because her mind had settled into a still, relentless clarity. By the time she heard the key in the lock, she knew exactly what she was going to say. Evan entered quietly, as if unsure whether he still belonged there. His coat hung loosely from his shoulders. He looked tired, older somehow, his confidence stripped down to something fragile. They stood facing each other for a moment. No greetings. No questions about the night. "You were there," he said finally, his voice low. It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded once. "I was." He exhaled and sat down heavily in the chair across from her, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm them. There was no attempt at denial, no elaborate explanation, just a tired surrender. "It started casually," he said. "I didn't plan it. I didn't think it would become anything serious." Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression unchanged. "When Marina told me she was pregnant," he continued, "everything shifted. I panicked. I didn't know how to end one life without destroying the other." He hesitated, then added, "I never wanted to lose you." Sarah studied his face, searching not for remorse, but for understanding. "You didn't make a single mistake," she said quietly. "You made a choice, and then you kept choosing it. For years." Evan looked down. "I know. I'm not questioning whether you cared," she went on. "I'm questioning how you thought this was acceptable. To me. To her. To a child." He had no answer. The silence that followed was not tense. It was final. "You should go back to them," Sarah said at last. "Your daughter needs you, and so does the woman carrying your child." Evan looked up, startled. "Sarah, there's nothing to argue," she said gently. "This isn't a punishment. It's reality." She stood and went to the bedroom, pulling a suitcase from the closet. She packed efficiently, clothes, toiletries, documents, only what he would need for now. When she returned, she placed the suitcase by the door. Evan stood, hesitating only briefly before taking it. "I never meant to hurt you," he said. "I know," Sarah replied, "but intent doesn't change the outcome." He left without another word. When the door closed behind him, the apartment felt strangely calm. No echoes, no shouting, just a quiet certainty. The marriage had ended, not with chaos, but with an unmistakable sense of finality. For several minutes after the door closed, Sarah remained standing where she was. The apartment was silent in a way it had never been before. Not the familiar quiet of evenings spent alone, but a deeper absence, as if something essential had been removed from the space itself. She listened without really listening, waiting for some delayed reaction to arrive. Then it did. She reached for the nearest object on the table, a glass vase, a wedding gift she had never particularly liked, and threw it against the wall. The sound of it shattering startled her, sharp and final. She did not stop there. Another object followed, then another. A picture frame, a stack of papers, anything within reach that could break. The restraint she had practiced for years gave way all at once. She moved through the apartment without direction, her breath uneven, her hands trembling as she swept things from shelves and countertops. There were no words, no coherent accusations, just the physical release of everything she had held in: disappointment, confusion, the quiet shame of having believed in something that no longer existed. When there was nothing left to throw, she sank into a chair, her body suddenly heavy. Her arms ached. Her throat burned. The room around her was in disarray, fragments scattered across the floor like evidence of a storm that had passed through. The exhaustion came quickly and completely, not the kind that sleep could fix, but the kind that followed an emotional collapse. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, breathing slowly until the shaking stopped. As her pulse steadied, something unexpected followed. Clarity. The life she had known was gone, not temporarily altered, not damaged and in need of repair, permanently changed. The realization did not frighten her as much as she thought it would. It simply settled into place, undeniable and solid. She stood, wiped her face, and surveyed the room. The mess would need to be cleaned. The practical details would need to be addressed. Work, housing, legal matters, life, continuing forward whether she was ready or not. And she would continue with it. By the time she picked up the first shard of broken glass, Sarah understood that she was no longer a wife waiting for her husband to come home. That version of her belonged to the past. What stood in the ruined apartment now was a woman alone. And still standing. Evan returned a week later. This time, he did not come early in the morning or hesitate at the door. He arrived in the afternoon, his face drawn tight with a kind of fear Sarah recognized immediately. It was the look of someone who had received news he could not undo. They sat across from each other at the same kitchen table where their marriage had quietly ended. "The tests came back," he said, his voice unsteady. "They found a malignant tumor." Sarah felt the words land with a heavy, professional finality. Malignant. She asked the questions she needed to ask: where it was located, how advanced it appeared, what the initial treatment plan looked like. Evan answered as best he could. Surgery was required. Chemotherapy would follow. The doctors were cautious but hopeful. Early detection mattered, they said. Time mattered. "Marina is pregnant," Evan added, as if Sarah might have forgotten. "She's overwhelmed. She barely sleeps." Sarah nodded. She did not need to imagine the fear of a mother watching her child face something so serious. She had seen it too many times before. Evan hesitated, then said what he had clearly come to say. "We need money. Insurance will cover some of it. But not all. Not quickly. And the apartment," he stopped, swallowing hard. "It's marital property. If we sell it, we can split the proceeds. It would help cover the treatment." Sarah did not answer immediately. She understood the numbers without him spelling them out. Pediatric oncology was expensive. Even with coverage, there were deductibles, gaps, delays. She also understood what selling the apartment meant for her. She had nowhere else to go. No immediate backup plan. No certainty. Yet the image that came to her was not Evan's face or Marina's. It was Katie's, flushed with fever, struggling to breathe, trusting the adults around her to do the right thing. "I agree," Sarah said quietly. "We can sell it." Evan stared at her, relief and guilt crossing his expression at the same time. "I wouldn't ask if it weren't. I know," she interrupted. "This isn't about us." The decision was not an act of forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. It was simply the choice she could live with. They discussed practicalities, timelines, agents, paperwork without emotion. When Evan left, Sarah remained seated, her hands folded in front of her. She had chosen compassion over security, and as a result, she would soon be without a home. The knowledge settled heavily, but she did not take the decision back. Some consequences, she knew, were worth bearing. Sarah moved out 2 days after the listing went live. She packed what she could fit into suitcases and boxes, choosing practical things first: clothes, documents, medical textbooks she still referenced now and then. The apartment no longer felt like hers anyway. It felt borrowed, already halfway gone. Her friend let her stay without hesitation. There were no dramatic conversations, no pitying looks, just a spare room, clean sheets, and the unspoken understanding that this arrangement was temporary. Sarah was grateful for that. She did not want to feel like someone being rescued. The grief that followed was quiet. It did not flare into anger or self-pity. It settled into her chest like a constant pressure, present but manageable. She went to work, returned in the evenings, and spoke when spoken to. Life narrowed to essentials. They talked occasionally about logistics, about how quickly apartments were selling, about prices that seemed to rise every month, about how difficult it was to make decisions when everything felt uncertain. Sarah listened more than she spoke. Buying a new place felt premature, like committing to a future she was not ready to imagine yet. "I'll wait," she said finally, "just for now." At the hospital, she requested a leave of absence. Officially, it was to rest. Unofficially, it was because she knew she could not keep carrying everything at once. The paperwork went through easily. She had earned the time. It was only then, with her days suddenly unstructured, that she realized how exhausted she truly was. There was one place she knew would not ask her to explain herself. Her father lived in Hood River now, having moved there after her mother's death. The house was small, modest, surrounded by quiet and open space. She had not visited as often as she should have over the years. There had always been reasons. Work, Evan's schedule, the distance. Now, distance felt like an invitation. She called him that evening and told him she was coming for a while. She did not offer details. He did not press for them. "Stay as long as you need," he said simply. The decision brought an unexpected sense of relief. For the first time since everything had begun to unravel, Sarah allowed herself to stop planning and simply go somewhere she was not required to be strong. She needed time, and she needed silence. Hood River offered both. Life in Hood River moved at a different pace, one that did not demand explanations. Mornings began quietly, with her father already awake, the kettle on, the radio murmuring low news reports from the kitchen. Sarah found herself slipping into the rhythm of the house without effort. Meals were simple, days unfolded without schedules. No one asked what she planned to do next. Her father did not try to fix anything. He listened when she spoke and sat with her when she did not. Sometimes they talked about practical things, the weather, the neighbors, small repairs around the house. Other times, conversation drifted toward memories of her mother, shared lightly, without the sharp edge of grief. Those moments grounded Sarah in a way she had not realized she needed. It was during one of those ordinary afternoons that she met Ethan Miller. He lived on the neighboring property and had stopped by to return a tool he had borrowed from her father weeks earlier. There was nothing remarkable about the meeting. No charged first impression. Ethan was polite, reserved, a man comfortable with silence. He greeted Sarah with a nod and a simple smile, then spoke to her father about routine matters, fences, winter weather, a leaking gutter. Over the next days, they crossed paths again. Sometimes it was a brief exchange near the driveway. Other times, they shared a cup of coffee at the kitchen table when Ethan stopped in to help with small chores. Conversation came easily, without probing questions or expectations. Ethan never asked why Sarah was there or how long she planned to stay. That absence of pressure mattered. As the year drew to a close, the neighbors suggested celebrating New Year's Eve together. Nothing elaborate, just food, music, and company. Sarah hesitated at first, unsure if she wanted to mark the turning of the year at all. In the end, she agreed. The evening was simple and warm. Laughter filled the room without effort. Someone brought homemade food. Someone else set up music. At midnight, there were no dramatic resolutions, no speeches about fresh starts, just quiet toasts and shared smiles. Standing there among people who expected nothing from her, Sarah felt something shift. Peace. Not happiness in its loud, convincing form. Just peace. The kind that settled gently, without asking to be noticed. For the first time in months, her thoughts did not race ahead to problems waiting to be solved. She was simply present. As the night wound down and she stepped outside into the cold air, Sarah realized that healing had begun, not because anything had been promised or resolved, but because she had finally allowed herself to rest where time moved slowly enough to breathe. Sarah returned to Portland in early January, carrying less with her than she had brought to Hood River. The time away had stripped life down to essentials, and she was determined not to rebuild it the same way it had been before. Ethan stayed in touch after she left. Their conversations were unforced. Practical at first, weather updates, small observations, shared jokes that did not require context. When Sarah mentioned that she needed to find a place of her own soon, Ethan offered help without ceremony. He knew a realtor in Portland, someone he trusted, someone who valued reputation over speed. The process moved steadily. There were viewings, paperwork, decisions that once would have overwhelmed her. Now they felt manageable. She chose a small apartment in a quiet building, nothing extravagant but bright, functional. And hers, signing the final documents, brought a sense of relief rather than triumph. It was not a new beginning, so much as a stable place to stand. During that time, Sarah remained in limited contact with Evan. The conversations were brief and factual. Katie's treatment had responded well. The doctors spoke cautiously, but remission was the word being used now. Marina's pregnancy was progressing without complications. A boy, Evan said, his voice carrying a restrained optimism. Sarah listened and responded appropriately. There was no jealousy, no bitterness, just distance, the kind that came after acceptance, not avoidance. Her connection with Ethan deepened quietly. They spent time together without labeling it, meeting for dinners, long walks, conversations that stretched late into the evening. Eventually, Ethan told her what he had not shared before. He was infertile. He said it plainly, without drama or self-pity. His marriage had ended years earlier for that reason. Among others, he had spent a long time deciding what kind of future he wanted. "I still want a family," he said. "I just know now that it won't happen the way I once imagined. Adoption feels right to me." There was a pause, then honesty where hesitation might have been. He asked her to marry him, not as a solution, not as a rescue, but as a choice. Sarah did not answer immediately. She did not need to. She accepted because she understood what he was offering. Not replacement, not compensation, partnership. For the first time, her decision came without fear. She was not rebuilding what had been lost. She was building something new, deliberately and with clarity. Sarah and Ethan married in the spring. There was no large ceremony, no attempt to mark the moment with spectacle. They stood before a small group of people who had witnessed their quiet rebuilding. Her father, a few neighbors, friends who understood that this marriage was not born from urgency, but from intention. Sarah felt steady as she said her vows, grounded in a certainty she had never known before. Not long after, they began the adoption process. The waiting tested her patience in ways grief never had. Forms, interviews, home visits, questions that required honesty without defensiveness. When the call finally came, it arrived without warning. A baby boy needed a family. Immediately, they named him Noah. Sarah held him for the first time with a reverence that surprised her. Love did not arrive as a sudden wave. It came as a commitment, quiet, persistent, undeniable. Night feedings, exhaustion, the small, daily proofs of responsibility that slowly shaped them into a family. A year passed. It was during an ordinary week that Sarah began to feel unwell. Persistent fatigue, a strange loss of appetite, irritability she could not explain. She told herself it was stress, lack of sleep, the weight of new parenthood. As a physician, she delayed the obvious conclusion longer than most. When she finally scheduled the appointment, she did so with professional detachment. The confirmation dismantled that distance instantly. She was pregnant. The disbelief was immediate, followed by a rush of emotion she had no defense against. Gratitude, shock, a quiet awe that left her sitting in her car long after the appointment ended, her hands resting motionless in her lap. Telling Ethan was both terrifying and effortless. He stared at her, silent at first, then pulled her into an embrace that held everything words could not. There were tears, laughter, a shared understanding that this did not replace what they already had. It expanded it. Their daughter was born the following year. Watching Noah meet his sister for the first time, Sarah understood something that had once felt unreachable. Family was not defined by biology alone, nor by sacrifice demanded without consent. It was built through choice, through responsibility, accepted freely, through love that showed up every day, regardless of circumstance. Loss, she realized, had not erased her future. It had reshaped it. What she carried forward was not bitterness, but resilience. Not resentment, but clarity. The quiet courage to choose compassion, even when it cost her something. If you're listening to this story, consider what family means to you. The one you were born into. The one you chose. The one you're still building. And if you've ever faced a moment where forgiveness, second chances, or unexpected paths challenged everything you believed, share your thoughts. Your story might help someone else find their way forward.